Welcome to A Journey into Joinery. In this new series, we're going to explore the art and science of woodworking joinery. As you can imagine, it's an incredibly complex, very involved subject matter with regard to woodworking. There's just countless number of ways to make each joint, as well as a countless number of joints that we use in woodworking. Now, what we would like to do for our starting point is to quickly take a look at a very basic joint where we join one board to another board at a right angle, end grain to edge grain. And then from there we'll start looking at different ways we can assemble these two boards together to create a nice strong joint. Now, I've taken the time here to glue up a couple of samples and bust them apart so that we can quickly analyze them and then look at how we can go about making a mortise and tenon joint. Now, as most woodworkers will tell you, when you join end grain to edge grain or face grain, it's a very weak joint and it will break right at that glue line. However, in our sample that we just did, we glued this joint together without any fasteners or any other type of joinery, just simply a basic butt joint. We let the glue cure overnight and broke apart the board the next day. And notice here that the actual wood failed before the glue joint. So it actually is a stronger joint than many people give it credit for. However, that does not mean that it's an acceptable joint. A more traditional way of joining together two boards at a right angle to each other is to use mortise and tenon joinery. Now, unlike the guys on television that'll tell you it's indestructible, I can tell you firsthand that it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to bust apart two boards that have been glued together with a mortise and tenon joint. That's not to say that it's a bad joint. It's a very good joint. But we have to look at it and examine it further, and we will start that examination process by looking at how we go about machining the mortises. Now, for me, I like to make my mortises first and then my tenons to fit the mortise. It just seems easier to control the size of the tenon. So that's where we'll begin our construction techniques on how to mill out a mortise. Now, we'll of course be showing you many different techniques over the next few issues before we even get to the tenon machining. Now, our first technique that we're going to show you is a very basic, very primary, primitive technique. It's not going to require any electricity, just chisels and mallets. And I'll be showing you some other little accessories along the way that will help ensure a greater accuracy or a more precise mortise. And we'll get into those at that stage. For the demonstration, we're going to be making a 1/2 inch wide by 2 inch long by 1.5 inch deep mortise. Now, there will be some guys that can just take a 1/2 inch chisel and work all along here, chopping out, wasting out this material and not damage the two sidewalls. I myself find that very difficult, and it's very hard for a beginner with their first few attempts with hand tools to accomplish. So I like to work by roughing out the center area first and then using a larger chisel to take care of the final edges. Now, we will be chiseling this out using a mallet and chisels, and we're going to be creating an awful lot of stresses on this workpiece. Now, if I just clamp it up in my bench vise like so, this top area isn't supported. I could easily split apart in this fashion. So what I like to do is encapsulate my work completely. So I got a couple scrap blocks here, and if I clamp up all of this like so, now I'm supporting that work on either side of our mortise where we're doing all of our work. So it just helps to support the work even more. Now, if you find that your chisels are cutting like a dull screwdriver, perhaps it's time to take the time to put a nice sharp edge on your chisels. When you're doing mortise work like this, where we're cutting a very deep pocket, you want a nice sharp tool that can cut through the fibers nicely and not tear and smash all the wood fibers out of the way. So a good sharp chisel is very important to this step. Now, as I mentioned, this is a 1/2 inch wide mortise, 2 inches long, and I'm going to rough out the center area first. So I'm going to use a 1/4 inch chisel. Now, if I had a 3/8 bench chisel, I could also use that in this area. Now, what I want to start out with is a couple of stop cuts, Again, about a 1/16 from the ends. I'm not going to go real deep. Now I'll just make some vertical chop cuts along its length. Now we'll waste out the rest of the material by working sideways. Now in this case, I'm working with the bevel down. Now if you find your materials splitting away like this oak is on me, take a nice wide chisel, in this case about a 1-inch wide chisel, again staying away from my finish line, and I'll create some cuts vertically again. These will be stop cuts, so to speak, and these will prevent that splintering from continuing on up onto our surface where the shoulder is going to meet up. Don't get carried away and go real deep on this. Just work a little bit at a time. And then we'll waste away that material. Now it's back to our vertical chopping cuts. And then we'll waste away the material again. Now I can start working a little bit more aggressively the deeper that I get, but I'm going to continue to make these vertical chopping cuts like so, and then I'll work sideways to clean out the waste. I'm getting very close to the bottom now. I'm at about 1 3/8 deep. So what I'm going to do is score my perimeter by making these vertical chop cuts. Now as you get down to this depth, you're going to notice that you can't angle your chisel properly without interfering at the top or bottom edge of your mortise and get in this center area. So it does require you to kind of pry it along like so, but be careful not to pry too hard to either break out the ends or crush the fibers of the wood up near the face. Now as we make our final cuts, we want to make sure that these two end cuts are perfectly straight up and down, and that when we make our width cuts, that they're also perfectly straight up and down and parallel to the outside faces. Now if you've got very good eye-hand coordination, you can pare this material out freehand. And for a while there I used to be able to do that, but with bifocals now I'm having a heck of a time, so I went back to my old jigs that I used to help me with that. Now the first cuts that I want to make will be the two end cuts. And this very simple jig, as you can see, it's nothing more than a flat block of wood with another block of wood on it. And if I take this block and I line it up like so, and clamp it together, if I bring my chisel straight down this surface, like so, as I continue on into the work, I'm going to have a nice straight wall. Now the only thing real critical about this particular jig is make sure that the bottom surface here and this surface here are at a right angle. And that way you'll know you'll have a nice straight edge going straight in that's perpendicular to this face of your stock. Now when you clamp it in your vise, you may want to take a square and verify that this leg is in fact square to this surface, and then you can make your vertical chopping cuts. Now at this point I'll go right to my 1/2-inch chisel, and I will have to be very careful to line it up front to back relative to your viewpoint. I want to make sure I'm right over the area where I want to make my cuts. Now I may not be able to go all the way down in one cut. Keep in mind that we still have material on our two side faces. So I can kind of pare that away a little bit. just by hand, and then I can continue down a little bit further. Working down as far as I think I can go on one side, I'll move over to the other side and repeat the process. And I was able to go in about 1/2 of an inch. Now, following the same technique to make the width of our mortise, we've got a couple more little jigs. They're all exactly the same jig, it's just that they allow for a different offset. Now, as you can see, it's nothing more than a thin block of wood, in this case an oak-faced MDF, and then I've got a strip of hardwood on here. And that thickness of that hardwood is what's going to control the distance from the outside edge to where we want the edge of our mortise to be. Now, in this case, it's 1/8 of an inch. This one has a 1/16 inch thick facing on it. And finally, this one, which is a 1/4 inch thick facing on it. And I've got them all marked so that I know what's what when I'm working with them. Now, in this case, we need an 1/8 inch wall thickness here, so I'll use my 1/8 inch jig. And the construction of this jig, again, cannot be easier. Block of wood, big enough that you can clamp onto the side of the workpiece, and then your shim. That shim, or that facing material here, doesn't have to be square or anything. All you want is the proper thickness to project over the edge like so. Now, just as we did with the other guide block, we can place our chisel tight against this surface and go straight down. Now, you may have too much material here to take all in one cut. So just take a series of paring cuts, and you'll get chips like so that are all piling up in the bottom of your hole that you got to clean out. Now, again, it's important to keep your chisel tight against this surface. If you allow it to walk away, it's going to go in at an angle like so, making the bottom of your mortise too large. And then when you get all done with your first mortise that you've cut out with your chisels and your mallet, saw it open, take a look on the inside, see what areas you need to improve on. Now, of course, working down the end grain here is very difficult. The tool's not going to want to cut through those fibers as easily as it will along these surfaces here. I did end up getting a little bit of tear out in here, so I was probably a little too aggressive. Now, as I mentioned, when you get down to this depth, working this bottom surface is very difficult because you, of course, have to work your tool in this fashion to cut away that bottom material. Now, working out toward the edge like so, you can get the tool angled pretty nicely. But in this middle area, like in here, it's very difficult to maneuver that tool. So the deeper you go with the mortise, the more difficult it becomes. Also, the narrower the mortise, the more difficult it is to work with hand tools. Now, this is probably at the extreme primitive level for creating a mortise. Obviously, we could drill out most of the material first and then finish it up with the chisels and so forth, but we'll be showing you those techniques at a later date. But this is the extreme primitive level. Now let's take a look at the extreme other end of things. Now let's take a look at the high-tech end of how to machine a mortise. Now, of course, we're going to use our CNC router, very over the top, very high-tech. But as you can see here, the program is very small. It's a very easy to write program, and we can jump right into running it. It only took me a couple of minutes to actually write this program, and it was written by hand, not using a CAD system. And as you can see as we're watching it cut here, it's only going to take a minute to machine this mortise. And as you can see, the CNC router did a real nice job machining out that mortise. Well, that's all the time we have in this issue for our journey into joinery. We looked at the most primitive way, with a mallet and chisels, the most high-tech way with the CNC router. In the next issue, we'll take a look at even more ways that we can go about machining these mortises. Then we'll move on to tenons, and then on to other types of joinery. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.